Ramitelli Airfield, Italy, June 24, 1944. Dawn arrived with the sound of Packard-built Merlin engines turning over, one by one, across the hardstand. The night shift mechanics had finished fueling 51 North American P-51 Mustangs, their tails painted crimson for identification. Inside the operations tent, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. reviewed weather reports from the Adriatic. The forecast showed clear skies over Romania, ideal for what commanders expected to be another routine escort mission to the Ploiești oil fields. But intelligence intercepts suggested otherwise. Luftwaffe controllers had ordered every available Messerschmitt Bf-109 from Jägerschwader 53 to intercept the bomber stream. What Allied planners anticipated as a standard penetration run would instead become a defining test, not of courage, which had never been questioned, but of a doctrine that prioritized protection over personal glory. By day's end, the numbers would tell a story that words alone could not. The War Department listed 992 trained pilots under the 332nd designation, the first all-black fighter group in United States history. Commanders questioned its combat readiness. Internal memoranda from 12th Air Support Command cited limited experience. Probable morale issues. These doubts reflected institutional prejudice more than tactical assessment. The unit's training record at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama contradicted every skeptical assumption. Their aircraft were Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, durable but obsolete against modern German types like the Focke-Wulf FW-190. Yet the group's commander, Colonel Davis, countered skepticism with uncompromising discipline. His standing order, Directive No. 7, read simply, "We will never leave the bombers." This principle would become the cornerstone of their operational philosophy. Training emphasized formation integrity and radio brevity. Simulated escort drills replaced mock dogfights. Statistical analysis from Tuskegee's Flight Operations Branch showed accident rates cut in half compared with other replacement groups. Every maneuver was practiced until it became instinctive. Pilots learned to think as a unit rather than as individuals hunting for personal victories. When the 332nd deployed to North Africa late in 1943, their doctrine differed from every other United States unit. While most squadrons pursued the enemy to maximize kill counts, Davis's men would measure success in bombers returned, not in victories claimed. This philosophy ran counter to the prevailing fighter-pilot culture, which celebrated aces and individual glory. The Red Tails chose a different path. They understood that their mission was not about personal recognition but about bringing bomber crews home alive. The group initially flew from bases in Tunisia, then moved to Italy as the Allied advance pushed northward. Their first aircraft were a mix of P-40 Warhawks and Bell P-39 Airacobras, both types already considered second-line equipment by 1944. Despite the limitations of their equipment, the pilots adapted. They learned to maximize the performance of what they had rather than complaining about what they lacked. Maintenance crews worked double shifts to keep aging aircraft operational. Supply shortages meant improvising repairs with whatever materials could be scavenged or requisitioned. By autumn of 1943, Allied headquarters quietly noted that the experimental unit had lower attrition than any white counterpart. This statistical fact began to chip away at institutional prejudice. Combat results could not be dismissed as easily as preconceived notions. The Red Tails were proving themselves where it mattered most, in the unforgiving arithmetic of aerial warfare. Allied forces had landed at Anzio, south of Rome, in January of 1944. The beachhead became a magnet for Luftwaffe attacks. German bomber and fighter-bomber units struck daily from bases near Viterbo, attempting to drive the Allies back into the Tyrrhenian Sea. The 332nd, flying a mix of P-39 Airacobras and Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, entered the rotation of convoy and harbor cover. Their mission was unglamorous but essential. Protect the ships unloading supplies and the troops dug in along the perimeter. Between January and March, operational records logged 311 sorties. United States Air Force archives credit 13 enemy aircraft destroyed during this period. More significantly, no bombers were lost while under 332nd escort. This perfect protection record began to attract attention. Radar reports from Anzio Control measured average reaction time, 90 seconds from sighting to intercept. This speed reflected both pilot skill and the disciplined formation tactics Davis had drilled into his squadrons. German pilot Lieutenant Heinz Hoyer wrote in his diary after one engagement, "Their response is instantaneous. They do not scatter." Hoyer's observation captured something important. Most Allied fighter groups would break formation to pursue individual targets, leaving gaps in bomber coverage. The Red Tails maintained formation discipline even when outnumbered. They understood that their job was not to chase every enemy aircraft but to create an impenetrable shield around the bombers. Yet skepticism persisted in higher commands. Reports continued to label them experimental. Some staff officers attributed their success to luck or to facing second-rate opposition. Others suggested they were being assigned easier missions. But the data told a different story, success ratios twice the theater average. The numbers were becoming impossible to ignore. Bomber group commanders who cared more about survival than politics began to notice. By March's end, mission planning logs added new wording, request 332nd escort. This notation represented a quiet revolution. White bomber crews, many from southern states where segregation was most rigid, were specifically asking for black pilots to protect them. Survival trumped prejudice. The Red Tails' reputation had shifted from untested to preferred within a single campaign. This transformation occurred not through propaganda or political pressure but through demonstrated competence under fire. Every mission where bombers came home intact was an argument that could not be refuted. North American P-51C and P-51D Mustangs arrived at Ramitelli Airfield in June of 1944. These aircraft represented a quantum leap in capability. Powered by Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V1657 engines delivering 1,490 horsepower, the Mustang combined speed, range, and firepower in a single airframe. Range with external drop tanks exceeded 1,650 kilometers, finally enough to reach targets in Austria and Romania. Previous aircraft like the P-40 could barely reach northern Italy before fuel limitations forced them to turn back. Technical briefings at 15th Air Force Headquarters recorded fuel consumption at 92 gallons per hour at cruise power settings. With internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons plus two external tanks of 110 gallons each, a P-51 could fly for over 6 hours. This endurance transformed escort strategy. For the first time, American fighters could accompany bombers all the way to distant targets and back. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait for escort fighters to reach their fuel limits before attacking. Mechanics painted the tails red for identification. This distinctive marking, chosen for practical visibility reasons, would become the unit's most famous symbol. Colonel Davis drafted a new escort geometry, overlapping 30-degree arcs instead of the standard loose top cover. The formation traded individual freedom of action for collective impenetrability. Each flight of 4 aircraft covered a specific sector. If one flight engaged an enemy, adjacent flights shifted to cover the gap. The system was rigid but devastatingly effective. Within weeks, Luftwaffe reports described tight American shields, bomber losses under their protection dropped below 1%. An extraordinary achievement given that the average loss rate across all 15th Air Force operations was approaching 3%. The difference was doctrine. While other fighter groups measured success by enemy aircraft destroyed, the Red Tails measured success by bombers protected. This difference in philosophy produced measurably different results. Enemy claims against the 332nd rose fivefold as German pilots attempted to break through the defensive screen. But Red Tail casualties remained remarkably low. The tight formation meant that any German fighter attempting to attack one bomber had to pass through multiple layers of defensive fire. Statistics suggested something unique was happening, a fundamental shift in how fighter escort could be conducted. The Red Tails were demonstrating that discipline could defeat aggression, that teamwork could overcome individual skill. The 49th Bomb Wing launched 51 consolidated B-24 Liberators toward the Giurgiu refineries at Ploiești on June 24, 1944. This complex of oil refineries produced approximately 30% of Germany's petroleum products. Destroying it would cripple the Wehrmacht's ability to fuel tanks, aircraft, and trucks. The mission was critical to the Allied strategic bombing campaign. Red Tails flew 2 escort elements at 24,000 feet, positioned above and behind the bomber formation. German controllers at Vienna detected the inbound raid and dispatched Messerschmitt Bf-109 GS from Jägerschwader 53. Their tactic was standard. Send a portion of fighters ahead as bait to lure the American escorts away from the bombers, then attack the unprotected bombers with a second wave. This bait-and-bounce approach had worked repeatedly against other Allied formations. German pilots knew that American fighter pilots were aggressive and hungry for personal victories. The temptation to pursue enemy aircraft often proved irresistible. The 332nd did not chase. When the first wave of Messerschmitts appeared, diving past the formation in what appeared to be a hasty retreat, the Red Tails held position. Their discipline was absolute. Pilots watched German fighters pass within firing range but did not break formation to pursue. Every attack vector remained anchored to the bomber box. The formation geometry Davis had designed meant that any German fighter attempting to reach the bombers had to fly through interlocking fields of fire. When the second wave attacked, expecting to find undefended bombers, they instead encountered the full defensive strength of both escort elements. Multiple Mustangs converged on each attacking fighter. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Reconnaissance photography taken after the raid showed 70% of the target complex destroyed. More importantly, all 51 bombers returned to base. 0 losses to enemy fighters, a statistic almost unprecedented in strategic bombing operations. Luftwaffe listening posts captured a frustrated transmission from one of the German fighters. "They do not follow. They guard." This comment revealed the psychological impact of facing an enemy who refused to behave according to expectations. German tactics relied on predictable American responses. The Red Tails had introduced unpredictability by being utterly predictable in their protective role. For bomber crews accustomed to watching their escort fighters disappear in pursuit of enemy aircraft, the new method was transformative. It turned defensive geometry into life insurance. Every bomber crew member understood that those Red Tails meant they had a better chance of seeing home again. Ploieschti convinced Allied planners that discipline could outperform aggression. The mission report circulated through 15th Air Force headquarters, then up to Mediterranean Allied Air Forces Command. For the first time, senior officers began to question whether the standard American fighter doctrine, emphasizing individual initiative and aggressive pursuit, was optimal for escort missions. The 332nd had demonstrated an alternative approach. Their success rate was forcing a doctrinal rethink. Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Lang of Jägerschwader 27 approached a formation of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses near Vienna in July of 1944. His Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 was equipped with a Revi gun camera synchronized with his weapons system. The camera recorded every engagement, providing evidence for victory claims and tactical analysis. As Lang began his attack dive from 28,000 feet, his camera captured the bomber formation in clear detail. It also captured what happened next. Frames recovered after the war show red-tailed Mustangs intersecting his flight path within seconds. The reaction time was so fast that Lang had no opportunity to complete his firing pass. He pulled up sharply, attempting to evade, but 2 P-51s followed him through the maneuver. Tracers passed within meters of his aircraft. He rolled inverted and dived, pushing his engine to emergency power. The Mustangs stayed with him. At 15,000 feet, with his airspeed approaching the structural limits of his aircraft and fuel running low, Lang jettisoned his canopy and bailed out. After landing by parachute and returning to his unit, Lang's debrief read, "Colored Americans fight precisely. We underestimated." This was a significant admission from a pilot with 17 confirmed victories. German intelligence had initially dismissed the 332nd as a propaganda unit of limited combat value. Lang's experience, and that of numerous other German pilots, forced a reassessment. United States records corroborate his loss. 1 Messerschmitt 109 destroyed, pilot recovered. The encounter was not exceptional. It was typical of engagements throughout July. Statistical summary for July 1944 showed bomber loss rate of 0.7% under 332nd escort versus 2.8% for missions protected by other fighter groups. This 4-to-1 difference in survival rates could not be explained by chance or by differences in enemy opposition. The Red Tails were flying the same missions, facing the same enemy, operating in the same theater. The only variable was doctrine. Their willingness to forego personal glory for mission success was producing measurably superior results. By late July, Luftwaffe Command issued new tactical directives. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged dogfights below 5,000 meters when facing Mustangs with red tails. This was an extraordinary admission. German fighter doctrine emphasized aggressive engagement. Ordering pilots to avoid combat under specific circumstances indicated that the 332nd had achieved something rare. Tactical superiority so marked that the enemy altered his doctrine to accommodate it. For the first time, official German operational orders acknowledged red tail superiority. This recognition came not from propaganda or political pressure but from the cold calculus of combat losses. German squadron commanders could not ignore the fact that their pilots were being shot down at higher rates when engaging the 332nd. The red tails had become a warning sign, a marker of danger that German pilots learned to respect. Behind each mission was an industrial routine that rarely received recognition but was essential to operational success. Engine overhaul intervals for the Packard Merlin averaged 112 hours, double the theater average. This extended service life reflected meticulous maintenance procedures developed by the unit's ground crews. The two-stage supercharger in the Merlin engine kept it delivering 1,200 horsepower at 25,000 feet, essential for matching the altitude of B-17 and B-24 bomber formations. Fuel logistics were intricate. Each P-51 required 410 gallons to fly a maximum range escort mission, 269 gallons internal plus 2 external tanks of 110 gallons each, minus fuel consumed during takeoff, climb, and combat. This fuel was delivered to Ramitelli from Naples in 55-gallon drums, transported by Douglas C-47 cargo aircraft. Each drum weighed approximately 400 pounds when full. Moving enough fuel for a 50-plane mission required coordination between multiple supply units, transportation assets, and storage facilities. Maintenance logs show aircraft readiness rates at 83%, the highest in 15th Air Force. This meant that on any given day, 83 out of every 100 aircraft were operational and ready for combat. The Air Force average was 68%. This 15-point difference meant that the 332nd could consistently field larger formations. More aircraft meant better coverage, which meant better protection for the bombers. A training program for African American mechanics, Unit 96, improved turnaround time by 22%. Turnaround time measured how quickly an aircraft could be refueled, rearmed, and returned to operational status after landing. Faster turnarounds meant that aircraft could fly more sorties per day. It also meant that damaged aircraft could be repaired and returned to service more quickly. The mechanics worked 18-hour shifts when necessary, often under primitive conditions with limited tools and parts. Replacement engines, propellers, and components came from 15th Air Force supply depots at Foggia. When standard supply channels moved too slowly, mechanics improvised. They cannibalized damaged aircraft for usable parts. They fabricated replacement components in makeshift machine shops. They begged, borrowed, and traded with other units to keep aircraft flying. This resourcefulness was born of necessity. Unlike some units that could afford to wait for proper parts, the 332nd operated under constant pressure to prove themselves. Every non-operational aircraft was ammunition for critics who wanted the experiment to fail. Every efficiency gained in maintenance and supply translated directly into sorties flown. More sorties meant more bomber crews protected. While Luftwaffe operations dwindled due to chronic fuel shortages and the systematic destruction of German oil production facilities, the Red Tails flew daily with mechanical precision. By August 1944, they were averaging 25 escort missions per week. This operational tempo would have been impossible without the extraordinary efforts of the ground crews who kept the aircraft flying. German controllers launched a coordinated deception operation on September 12, 1944. 20 Messerschmitt Bf-109s swept southward in a highly visible formation, broadcasting on frequencies known to be monitored by Allied intelligence. The intent was obvious: draw the American escort fighters away from the bomber stream. While the escorts chased the decoy force, Focke-Wulf FW-190s would climb unseen to bomber altitude and attack from the sun. This bait and ambush tactic had worked successfully against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. German planners assumed it would work against the Americans as well. The 332nd's radar liaison officer at Ramitelli had intercepted fragments of German coordination traffic earlier that morning. The intercepts were incomplete. German controllers used code words and brief transmissions to minimize the risk of direction finding, but they suggested a planned operation involving multiple fighter wings. This intelligence was passed to the escort flight leaders before takeoff. Colonel Davis's instructions were explicit: maintain formation discipline regardless of apparent threats. When the decoy force appeared, diving past the bomber formation in an obviously provocative manner, the Red Tails held position at 24,000 feet. They ignored the bait completely. Pilots watched the Messerschmitts pass below them, heading south at high speed. Radio discipline remained absolute. No one broke formation. No one pursued. The German pilots must have been confused. In every previous operation, this maneuver had triggered an immediate American response. The Focke-Wulf 190s appeared 15 minutes later, climbing from the northeast at full power. Their timing was perfect. They had estimated that the American escorts would be 30 kilometers south, chasing the decoy force. Instead, they found the complete escort formation exactly where it had been. The element of surprise, which they had counted on to enable an unmolested attack run, did not exist. When the FW-190s committed to their attack, expecting to face only bomber defensive fire, Mustangs rolled into them head-on. Head-on attacks were psychologically devastating. Closure rates exceeded 1,000 kilometers per hour. Both aircraft were firing at each other, but the defender, in this case the Mustang, had the advantage of knowing the attack was coming. The element of surprise worked in reverse. 11 German fighters fell in the engagement. Combat camera footage shows multiple FW-190s breaking away with visible damage, streaming smoke or coolant. None reached the bombers. The bomber formation continued to its target without loss. Captured radio logs from the operation, recovered after the war from German archives, contained one exasperated phrase: "They will not follow." This frustration reflected a deeper problem for the Luftwaffe. German fighter tactics relied on predictable enemy behavior. When the enemy refused to behave predictably, the tactics failed. The 332nd had introduced a fundamental unpredictability into the tactical equation. They were completely predictable in their protective role and completely unpredictable in their refusal to be drawn away. Doctrine, once ridiculed by some American pilots as timid or unaggressive, had turned into an unbeatable defensive model. The September 12th engagement was analyzed extensively by 15th Air Force intelligence. The after-action report concluded that disciplined adherence to escort doctrine, combined with effective use of intelligence about enemy intentions, had resulted in a perfect defensive victory. This analysis circulated through fighter command channels, influencing tactical thinking across the Mediterranean theater. General Nathan F. Twining's memorandum to United States Army Air Forces Headquarters, dated October 15, 1944, summarized the 332nd's combat record in language that was both precise and unprecedented. No bomber under 332nd escort has been lost to enemy fighters. This single sentence represented a statistical achievement unmatched in the European air war. Statistics verified 221 completed escort missions with a 99% survival rate for protected bombers. The remaining 1% of losses were attributed to anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and weather, not to enemy fighters. Colonel Davis received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership. The citation specifically mentioned his development of the close escort doctrine and his personal example of disciplined adherence to mission objectives. But the recognition extended beyond individual awards. Request forms at 15th Air Force operations now included a checkbox: Red Tail Escort desired analysis of mission planning documents from October and November 1944 shows that this checkbox was marked affirmatively in 87% of cases, where bomber groups had a choice of escort. This preference was not driven by political correctness or military orders. Bomber group commanders made pragmatic decisions based on survival statistics. They knew that a mission escorted by the 332nd had significantly better odds of returning without losses. Bomber crews knew it too. Letters home, intercepted and analyzed by military censors, frequently mentioned relief at seeing red tails. One B-17 navigator wrote, "When we see those red tails, we know someone's got our back." The statistical record by the end of 1944 was overwhelming. The 332nd had escorted bombers on missions totaling over 100,000 kilometers of flight distance. They had engaged enemy aircraft on 103 occasions, claiming 111 enemy aircraft destroyed with confirmation for 69. More significantly, they had lost only 26 pilots killed in combat, a loss rate substantially below the theater average. Their success rate in protecting bombers was approximately 3 times better than the average for all fighter groups in the Mediterranean theater. By year's end, the Pentagon was forced to reconsider segregation policy within the Army Air Forces. The 332nd's record made it impossible to maintain the fiction that African American pilots were inherently less capable than white pilots. Data, not opinion, was driving policy change. The irony was not lost on anyone. A unit created as an experiment to demonstrate the limitations of black pilots had instead demonstrated their exceptional capability. Success on this scale could not be explained away or attributed to favorable circumstances. Senior officers who had opposed the formation of black flying units now faced an uncomfortable reality. The experimental unit they had expected to fail had become one of the most effective fighter groups in the theater. Their success challenged fundamental assumptions about race and capability. It suggested that the problem had never been the potential of black pilots, but the institutional barriers that had prevented them from proving that potential. The 332nd had not just succeeded, they had succeeded so decisively that failure to acknowledge their achievement would have been professional malpractice. 600 heavy bombers of 15th Air Force launched for Berlin and Brandenburg on March 24, 1945. The distance from Ramitelli to Berlin was approximately 1,600 kilometers, near the operational limit of the P-51's range even with external tanks. Red Tails led and trailed the bomber columns in 4-ship flights, maintaining their characteristic tight formation. This would be the longest escort mission the 332nd had attempted. It would also be their most visible. At 10:45 hours, German radar installations at Neubrandenburg detected the inbound formation. Every available Messerschmitt Bf-109 within range scrambled to intercept. The defense of Berlin was considered a matter of national survival. By March 1945, the Soviet Army was within 80 kilometers of the city from the east. American bombers attacking from the south represented a strategic and psychological threat that could not be ignored. The Luftwaffe threw everything available into the defense. Combat reports list 25 German aircraft destroyed for 3 P-51 losses. The exchange ratio, over 8-1 in favor of the Americans, reflected both superior equipment and superior tactics. The Mustang was faster than the Messerschmitt 109 at all altitudes and had better high-altitude performance. But technology alone did not explain the disparity. Formation discipline meant that isolated German fighters faced multiple opponents. The Red Tails operated as a coordinated system, not as individuals. Bomber loss rate for the mission was 0.46%, the lowest recorded for any major raid in the European War. United States Strategic Air Forces Europe confirmed, escort effectiveness unmatched. This was official recognition at the highest level. Strategic Air Forces Europe controlled all American air operations over Germany. Their assessment carried weight. Berlin's anti-aircraft commanders had planned their defense assuming 10% bomber losses, a figure based on historical averages. They achieved less than 1%. The difference represented approximately 50 bombers and 300 airmen who survived because of effective escort. The mission that was meant to bleed the bomber force instead broke the Luftwaffe's confidence entirely. German fighter pilots had been told for years that the Allies could not effectively defend their bombers over Germany. They had been assured that German fighters, flown aggressively, could always break through to attack. The Berlin mission demonstrated that these assurances were false. The psychological impact on German morale was significant. Pilots who had once believed in ultimate victory now faced the reality that the air war was lost. Post-mission analysis by 15th Air Force Intelligence concluded that the 332nd's performance over Berlin represented the culmination of 2 years of doctrinal refinement. Every lesson learned from Anzio, Ploiești, Vienna, and dozens of other missions had been incorporated into their tactics. The result was a level of operational effectiveness that set a new standard for fighter escort. Other groups began studying red tail tactics and attempting to replicate their success. By April 1945, Luftwaffe pilot strength was down 70% from its peak in 1943. New pilots entering operational squadrons averaged 110 hours of flight training, compared with 240 hours in 1943. This reduction in training time reflected Germany's desperate shortage of fuel and instructors. Inexperienced pilots flying obsolete aircraft with insufficient fuel made easy targets. Fuel reserves fell below 10 million liters, insufficient for 2 weeks of sustained combat operations. The Luftwaffe was collapsing not from lack of courage but from lack of resources. The 332nd flew over 260 sorties in April. Combined claims across all Allied escort groups for the month totaled 260 enemy aircraft destroyed, with 112 confirmed to the Red Tails. This number represented over 40% of all enemy aircraft destroyed by escort fighters during the month, achieved by a single group that represented less than 8% of total Allied fighter strength. The disparity suggested that something beyond simple combat effectiveness was occurring. The 332nd had achieved a level of operational maturity that most units never reached. Captured documents from Luftwaffe, the air command responsible for defense of German airspace, described continuous losses to Mustang formations unacceptable. This language, found in multiple reports from different German commands, indicated institutional recognition that the defensive battle was lost. Pilots were being ordered to attack but were increasingly reluctant to press attacks against well-defended bomber formations. The fear of encountering red-tailed Mustangs specifically appeared in several pilot accounts recovered after the war. United States analysis concluded that disciplined escort strategy, coupled with superior fuel logistics, had neutralized German interception capability. The Luftwaffe could still launch fighters, but they could no longer effectively threaten bomber formations protected by competent escorts. The strategic bombing campaign, which had cost tens of thousands of Allied airmen in 1943 and early 1944, was by April 1945 achieving its objectives with minimal losses. The 332nd had played a disproportionate role in this transformation. What began as a social experiment, an attempt to determine whether African American pilots could perform effectively in combat, had become a decisive operational asset. The experiment's designers had assumed that black pilots would be adequate at best. Instead, they had proven to be exceptional. Their success was not accidental. It reflected superior training, superior discipline, and a doctrine that prioritized mission success over individual glory. These factors, combined with outstanding equipment and logistics support, produced results that changed both tactical doctrine and social policy. The question that military planners now faced was not whether black pilots could be effective but why they had been excluded for so long. The 332nd's record suggested that talent and capability existed across all segments of American society. Institutional barriers, not individual limitations, had prevented this talent from being utilized. The cost of this barrier, measured in bomber crews lost because effective escorts were not available, was incalculable. With Germany collapsing in May 1945, Stars and Stripes newspaper printed the headline "Red Tails Prove Invincible." The article detailed the 332nd's combat record and quoted bomber crews describing their relief at seeing crimson-tailed Mustangs. The story was picked up by civilian newspapers across the United States. For the first time, many Americans learned that black pilots had been flying combat missions throughout the war. The publicity forced a broader conversation about segregation in the military. Bomber crews testified repeatedly to the psychological impact of the Red Tails' protection. Navigator Lieutenant Arnold White recalled in his after-action interview, "We looked for them like a lighthouse. This metaphor captured something essential about the relationship between bomber crews and their escorts. In the chaos and terror of combat over enemy territory, the red tails represented safety and professionalism. Crews knew that those specific pilots would not abandon them. That knowledge was worth more than any tactical advantage." Colonel Davis noted in his final wartime report, "Their trust was earned statistically." This understated comment reflected his leadership philosophy. He had never asked for special treatment or recognition based on race. He had insisted only that his pilots be allowed to compete on equal terms. The statistics proved that equal terms meant equal or superior performance. The bomber crew's trust was the ultimate validation, not of propaganda or policy, but of demonstrated capability under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The 332nd received a Presidential Unit Citation for the Berlin mission and for their overall combat record. This was one of the highest awards a military unit could receive. The citation specifically mentioned their outstanding courage and superb airmanship, and their significant contribution to the defeat of the German Luftwaffe. These were not empty words. The citation was supported by documented combat records that showed a level of performance rarely achieved by any unit in any war. Even captured German prisoners referenced the red tails in interrogations. One Luftwaffe pilot, when asked about American fighter tactics, advised, "Avoid the red tails. They shoot true." This assessment from an enemy pilot carried particular weight. It indicated that the 332nd's reputation extended beyond American forces to the Germans themselves. Their distinctive markings, originally chosen for practical identification purposes, had become a symbol recognized and respected by both sides. By war's end, the transformation was complete. A unit formed as an experiment, doubted by many, had become legendary. Their success was built on discipline, training, and an unwavering commitment to their mission. They had protected bomber crews, destroyed enemy aircraft, and demonstrated beyond any doubt that capability was not determined by race. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen would extend far beyond their combat record, influencing military integration and the broader civil rights movement that followed the war. The statistical record of the 332nd Fighter Group, compiled in the months after Germany's surrender, documented 1,578 combat missions, 196 aircraft destroyed confirmed, and an escort success rate unmatched by any other fighter group in the European theater. These numbers represented more than tactical victories. They represented a fundamental challenge to institutionalized racism. The argument that black pilots were inherently less capable had been destroyed by data that could not be disputed. President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9801 on July 26, 1948, mandating integration of the United States Armed Forces. The order stated that there would be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. While many factors contributed to this decision, the combat record of units like the 332nd provided irrefutable evidence that segregation had no rational justification. Performance data from the war had demonstrated that capability was individual, not racial. The process of integration was neither immediate nor smooth. Resistance from within the military delayed full implementation until the 1950s. But the direction was irreversible. The Tuskegee Airmen had proven that given equal training, equal equipment, and equal opportunity, black servicemen performed at least as well as white servicemen. In the specific case of escort effectiveness, they had performed measurably better. This achievement could not be erased or explained away. Colonel Davis, promoted to general officer rank in 1954, became the first African-American general in the United States Air Force. His promotion reflected both his personal achievement and the institution's recognition that the barrier preventing black officers from reaching senior rank had been arbitrary and counterproductive. Davis went on to command fighter wings and air divisions, demonstrating at every level that competence was the only relevant criterion for leadership. The P-51 Mustangs flown by the 332nd were mostly scrapped after the war. A few survived as museum pieces or private restorations. One aircraft, serial number 4472190, is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Its tail is painted red. Visitors walking past see the faded paint and worn aluminum skin of an aircraft that flew combat missions over Europe. Few realize they are looking at a piece of social history as significant as its military history. The personnel of the 332nd returned to an America where segregation remained legal in much of the country. Pilots who had commanded respect over Europe faced discrimination at home. This contradiction, honored as heroes abroad, treated as second-class citizens at home, highlighted the gap between America's stated ideals and its actual practices. The irony was bitter. Men who had risked their lives defending freedom returned to a country that denied them full citizenship. Yet their achievement could not be diminished. They had proven their capability under the most demanding circumstances possible. Every bomber crew they brought home was evidence. Every mission they flew was testimony. Every statistic in their combat record was an argument that could not be refuted. They had changed military policy not through protest but through performance. They had demonstrated that the only relevant measure of a pilot was skill, courage, and dedication, not the color of his skin. Ramitelli Airfield was abandoned after the war. The runways, once busy with Mustangs and Thunderbolts, fell into disrepair. Local farmers reclaimed the land. By the 1960s, few traces remained of the base that had been home to the 332nd Fighter Group. Nature erased what history had preserved. But the legacy of what happened there could not be erased so easily. The Tuskegee Airmen returned to civilian life carrying experiences that most Americans could never understand. They had faced both enemy fire and institutional racism. They had proven themselves in combat while fighting a two-front war, one against the Axis powers, one against prejudice within their own country. Some became commercial pilots when airlines began hiring black aviators in the 1960s. Others pursued different careers. All carried the knowledge that they had participated in something historically significant. Reunions began in the 1970s as veterans sought to reconnect with comrades who had shared their unique experience. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They preserved memory, they honored fallen comrades, and they reminded younger generations that the fight for equality had required courage on multiple battlefields. Guest speakers at these reunions often included former bomber crews who credited the Red Tails with saving their lives. The bonds formed in combat proved stronger than the passage of time. In 1998, President William J. Clinton approved legislation authorizing a gold medal honoring the Tuskegee Airmen. The Congressional Gold Medal represented recognition at the highest level of government. The ceremony in 2007 brought surviving airmen to Washington to receive an award that acknowledged both their military achievement and their contribution to civil rights. By that time, most were in their 80s. Many had waited over 60 years for this formal recognition. The story of the Red Tails entered popular culture through books, documentaries, and films. Each retelling emphasized different aspects of their story. Some focused on combat, others on the struggle against discrimination, still others on individual personalities. While these portrayals varied in accuracy and emphasis, they served an important purpose. They ensured that the Tuskegee Airmen would not be forgotten. A generation that had never heard of the 332nd Fighter Group learned about the pilots who never lost a bomber. Educational programs began incorporating the Tuskegee Airmen story into curricula about World War II and civil rights history. Students learned that courage meant more than facing enemy fire. It also meant facing institutional barriers and proving capability despite systemic disadvantages. The airmen's story demonstrated that change often came not through confrontation but through undeniable demonstration of competence. They had won their battles with statistics, discipline, and professionalism. By the 21st century, the term Tuskegee Airmen had entered the American lexicon as shorthand for excellence achieved despite adversity. Their combat record remained unmatched. But their larger achievement was demonstrating that institutional barriers based on race were artificial and counterproductive. They had proven that capability existed across all segments of society, and that excluding any group from full participation meant wasting valuable talent. The last of the Tuskegee Airmen are passing now. Each year brings more funerals, more memorial services, more final salutes. Within a decade or two, none will remain. but their legacy is permanent. They changed military policy. They influenced the civil rights movement. They demonstrated that courage takes many forms. They proved that excellence recognizes no color. They showed that doing your job well, regardless of circumstances, can change the world. The numbers tell part of the story: 1,578 combat missions, 99% bomber protection rate, 196 enemy aircraft destroyed. These statistics are impressive, but they do not capture the human meaning behind them. Every bomber that came home carried 10 men who lived because someone refused to abandon them. Every enemy aircraft destroyed meant one less threat to Allied lives. Every mission flown meant another demonstration that the experiment was succeeding beyond anyone's expectations except, perhaps, the airmen themselves. The final assessment of the 332nd Fighter Group must acknowledge that they operated under unique pressures. They knew they represented more than themselves. Every mission was a test. Every mistake would be attributed to race rather than to individual error. Every success had to be extraordinary just to be acknowledged as adequate. This burden would have crushed a less determined group. They transformed it into motivation. Colonel Davis's Directive No. 7, "We will never leave the bombers," summarized a philosophy that extended beyond tactics. It represented commitment, discipline, and an understanding that mission success mattered more than personal glory. This philosophy, unusual in a fighter-pilot culture that celebrated individual aces, produced measurably superior results. It suggested that the best measure of success might not be individual achievement but collective accomplishment in service of a larger mission. The Red Tails are gone now, replaced by faster aircraft in different configurations. The pilots who flew them are mostly gone too, but what they achieved remains. They demonstrated that when given equal opportunity, capability would determine outcomes, not prejudice, not preconception, not institutional barriers. They proved it where proof mattered most. In combat, under conditions where failure meant death. Their victory was not just military but moral. They won battles and changed minds. They defeated enemies abroad and challenged injustice at home. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.